The first writing on Earth may not have begun with a story. It may have begun with loss. A world was growing too large for memory alone, and the human mind could no longer hold every name, every field, every debt, every vanished voice. So people pressed marks into clay, trying to keep one fragile world from disappearing. But some of those marks still stand between memory and silence. What kind of world was already gone when writing began, and why does the oldest writing on Earth describe a world before us that no one can finish translating? Before the first mark was pressed into clay, human life already had its own forms of memory. People did not live in silence because they had no writing. They carried the world inside voices, gestures, paths, scars on tools, repeated work, and remembered names. A field could be known because a family had walked its edges for many seasons. A debt could be remembered because witnesses heard it spoken aloud. A story could survive because older mouths returned to it again and again, until younger ears learned the order of its images. Long before tablets, ink, or signs arranged in rows, the human mind was a living archive. But it was an archive made of bodies. It needed breath. It needed attention. It needed people to remain close enough to repeat what mattered. The quiet fact about our beginning. For most of human existence, memory was not outside us. It was held in the brain, carried in the voice, and protected by the group. The earliest humans did not need writing to be human. They needed memory, imitation, and shared attention. The same deep abilities that let a child learn where water might be found, which plant was safe, when an animal track was fresh, or why a certain place should not be disturbed. In that older world, knowledge was not stored on a surface. It moved from person to person. It passed through work. It rested in habits that were repeated until they seemed almost natural. A hand learned how to shape stone because another hand had shaped stone before it. A path through grass became a map because many feet had used it. A name stayed alive because someone spoke it at the right time. But this kind of memory had limits. It was warm and human, yet fragile. If a person died before speaking, a detail could vanish. If a group moved too far away, a promise could weaken. If too many goods, names, places, and duties had to be held at once, even careful minds could lose their grip. The problem did not appear because people were less intelligent before writing. It appeared because human societies slowly created more things than memory alone could safely carry. As communities became more settled in some regions, especially where farming and storage became important, life began to gather weight. Grain had to be counted. Animals had to be watched. Tools had to be shared, repaired, or owed. Work had to be remembered across days and seasons. The human body, which had once carried knowledge through movement and speech, now faced a quieter pressure. A spoken agreement could fade. A remembered number could change. A witness could forget, leave, or die. At the origin of writing, there was not only curiosity, but strain. The strain of making human memory stretch beyond one lifetime, one family, one evening conversation. Before writing, repetition was one answer. People repeated rituals, routes, names, measures, and tasks until they became stable. Repetition made memory stronger, but it also showed how easily memory could be lost. A song may preserve an order, yet it still needs a singer. A carved mark may remind the eye, yet it may not speak by itself. A token may stand for an animal or a measure of grain, yet someone must know the rule that gives it meaning. The oldest writing emerged from this long border between memory and forgetting. It did not suddenly create civilization from emptiness. It appeared after people had already built worlds of obligation, labor, exchange, and shared time. When we look toward the earliest writing on Earth, we are not looking at the first moment humans began to think. We are looking at the moment when thinking, remembering, and counting began to leave the human body and settle onto matter, because the world people had made was becoming too large to carry by memory alone. A small group can remember many things, because life remains close to the body. A person can know who made a tool, who promised help, which path leads to water, and which family kept seed from the last harvest. But when people begin to live in larger settled communities, memory has to carry a different kind of weight. It is no longer only remembering where to walk or what season brings rain. It becomes remembering how much grain entered a storage room, how many jars were taken out, which workers received food, which animals belonged to whom, and what was promised before witnesses who may not always be present. This is where the quiet pressure behind early writing begins to appear, not as a sudden miracle, and not as a message from a forgotten world, but as a practical answer to a human limit. The brain that once helped our ancestors survive by tracking sound, smell, danger, kinship, and landscape was now being asked to hold a growing network of amounts, duties, names, and time. Farming did not simply give people food, it gave them delay. Seeds were planted long before they were eaten. Grain was stored long before it was distributed. Labour done in one season might matter in another. A promise made in the morning might need to be remembered after many moons. The older human world, shaped by movement and immediate attention, had depended on what could be seen, heard, repeated, and taught face to face. But settled life created distance inside time itself. A field stayed in place even when the people who worked it changed. A storehouse could outlive the memory of the person who first filled it. A herd could grow, shrink, be divided, or owed. Once life began to gather around fields, temples, households, and storage spaces, memory was no longer only a personal gift. It became a public burden. At the beginning of human life, memory had been tied to survival in the body. The hand remembering a tool, the eye remembering a track, the ear remembering a warning call, the group remembering a dangerous place. In early farming towns, that same ancient ability had to stretch toward things no body could carry alone. Numbers are strange because they seem simple, yet they are easy to lose when they are not fixed. 10 baskets can become 9 in one person's memory and 11 in another's. A name can be confused with another name. A share of food can be remembered differently by the giver and the receiver. In a world without writing, trust depends heavily on repeated presence. People must know each other, hear each other, and remain within the same circle of memory. But growing communities loosened that circle. More people meant more relationships that were not intimate. More goods meant more chances for confusion. More storage meant more time between action and consequence. This did not mean that early people were careless. It meant that their societies were beginning to ask memory to act like a storehouse itself. A human mind can hold stories with emotion and meaning, but long lists of amounts resist the warmth of memory. They become dry, unstable, and heavy. This may be why some of the earliest written marks seem so ordinary. They often point toward accounting, counting, allocation, and administration rather than poetry or prophecy. That ordinariness is important. It suggests that writing grew from the pressure of managing a world that had already become complex before it left clear words behind. The first marks did not need to describe the whole soul of a civilization. They only needed to make one thing stay still: a quantity, a name, a duty, a remembered exchange. In that stillness, something changed. Memory began to move from breath into clay. Human life gained a new kind of shadow, one that could remain after the speaker was gone. Writing did not have to begin as a beautiful sentence in order to change human history. It could begin as a mark that kept a basket of grain from being forgotten. It could begin as a small sign beside a number, a pressed shape that reminded someone of sheep, jars, fields, or labour owed. To modern eyes, that may seem humble, almost disappointing. We often imagine the oldest writing as a doorway into myths, kings, sacred stories, or hidden wisdom. Yet the colder truth is that the first surviving records often speak in a quieter voice. They suggest that writing was born close to storage rooms, counting systems, distribution, and the daily need to make something stay accurate after speech had faded. This does not make early writing less meaningful, it makes it more human. Before people wrote long stories, they had already made worlds where food could be gathered in one place, work could be assigned, goods could be moved, and responsibility could pass from one day to another. A mark in clay was not only a sign, it was a way of saying that memory alone was no longer enough. At the beginning of human life, knowledge had lived in bodies. A child learned by watching hands, a hunter learned by reading tracks, a gatherer learned by returning to the same slope, the same season, the same quiet pattern of leaves and fruit. Memory was active, breathing, and shared. But when settled communities grew, some knowledge no longer stayed close to the eye or hand. Grain stored behind a wall could not always tell its own history. A flock counted in the morning might be divided by evening. A worker given food today might be remembered differently tomorrow. The mark on clay answered that problem with a kind of stillness. It did not feel hunger, pride, fear, or sleep. It did not grow old as quickly as the body that made it. It could sit in a room and wait. That waiting changed the relationship between people and time. A spoken word depends on a listener. A remembered promise depends on a living mind. But a written mark can remain after the voice has stopped. This is why the earliest writing describes a world before us in a strange way. It does not describe it like a storyteller sitting beside a fire. It describes it through what people needed to preserve. Amounts, names, duties, offerings, movements of goods, traces of administration. Behind each dry record there may have been hands, backs, meals, arguments, seasons, and tired bodies, but the tablet rarely gives those things directly. It gives the hard edge of the system, not the full warmth of the life inside it. That is the loss hidden inside the invention. Writing saved certain kinds of memory by letting them leave the body, but it also chose what would survive. A number could remain while the face disappeared. A name could remain while the voice was gone. A record could outlive the person whose labour stood behind it. It also changed what future people could ask, because the surviving evidence would often answer questions about management more clearly than questions about tenderness, grief, memory, or private meaning. In that sense, writing began not only as preservation, but also as a filter. It carried some things across thousands of years and allowed others to fall away almost completely. When we look at those early marks now, we are seeing the moment when human memory became material. Clay became a second mind, but a narrow one. It held what early societies most urgently needed to control and remember. Not everything they felt, feared, hoped, or understood. And so the first writing does not simply open the past. It reminds us that the past was already being reduced at the very moment it was being saved. Long before signs became writing, people were already making memory visible. A notch on bone, a mark on wood, a pebble placed with other pebbles, a painted animal on a cave wall, a small clay shape held in the hand. None of these things should be treated as writing in the full sense, because most of them did not record spoken sentences, yet they show something important about the human mind. Humans were not waiting for writing to begin remembering. They were trying to give memory a surface, a shape, and sometimes a place outside the body. At the deep beginning of our species, survival depended on noticing patterns that could not be ignored. The return of animals, the change of seasons, the difference between fresh and old tracks, the location of water, the safe moment to move. Those patterns lived first in the senses. But over time, people also made marks that helped the eye return to something when the voice was absent. A mark could be a reminder, even if it was not yet a word. A token could stand for a counted thing, even if it did not yet carry a sound. A painted image could hold attention around an animal, a place, or a shared memory, even if its exact meaning is beyond us now. This is where the story of early writing has to move slowly. It is tempting to look at every old sign and call it language, but that would be too easy. A footprint is a sign, but not writing. A row of cuts may count something, but counting alone is not the same as speech. A drawing may carry meaning for a group, but it may not tell us how a sentence was spoken. The long road toward writing passed through these uncertain forms, visible traces that helped memory, but did not yet become a complete system for recording words. This matters because the oldest writing did not appear from emptiness. It grew out of older human habits of marking, counting, sorting, and remembering. In some early farming and herding communities, small objects could help represent goods before full written signs became common. A shaped token might be connected with an animal, a measure, or a product. When many goods had to be tracked, these objects made memory less dependent on one person's mind. They were simple, but they changed the balance between body and world. A human could hold a thought, but a token could keep pointing after the thought had moved away. A mark could remain after the person who made it had turned to another task. At the origin of human history, the body was the first instrument of knowledge. Hands, eyes, ears, walking feet, repeating mouths. Pre-writing signs began to place small pieces of that knowledge outside the body, where others might see and handle them. Still, these early signs were not a single invention with one meaning everywhere. They were local, practical, and often silent to us now. Some may have counted, some may have marked ownership, some may have supported ritual or teaching, some may have helped people organize work, food, animals, or time. The danger is to force them into a modern idea of text. They are better understood as steps along a border. On one side was living memory, carried by people. On the other side was writing, a system that could preserve language more directly. Between them were objects, marks, images, and gestures that made remembering more stable without fully becoming speech. And in that borderland, the world before writing becomes easier to feel, a world where humans were already asking matter to remember what the mind could lose. Those traces were modest, but they reveal the first slow separation between memory as a living act and memory as a durable thing that could wait in silence for another human mind later. A mark can carry meaning without carrying speech. This is one of the quiet difficulties in looking back toward the first signs humans made. When a person scratches lines into bone, arranges stones, paints an animal, shapes a small object from clay, or seals something inside a container, there may be intention there. There may be memory. There may even be a shared rule known to the people who used it. But it does not always mean that the mark was a word, or that it preserved a sentence exactly as someone once spoke it. The road toward writing is therefore not a straight line from picture to alphabet, or from drawing to book. It is a slow widening of what matter could hold for the human mind. Some signs probably help people count. Some may have marked a group, a place, a thing owned, a ritual action, or a repeated task. Others may have carried meanings that were understood only within a living community and lost once that community vanished. This is why the oldest traces before writing feel both close and distant. They show hands like ours making order, but they do not always tell us what order meant to them. At the beginning of human life, long before cities or tablets, people already depended on memory that was shared through bodies. A child learned by watching. A group remembered through movement, sound, and repeated attention. The first outside signs did not replace that living memory, they supported it. A tally might help recall a number, but someone still had to know what was being counted. A token might stand for an animal or a measure of grain, but someone still had to understand the agreement behind it. A painted shape might gather attention around a creature or a place, but the full meaning may have lived in voices, gestures, and circumstances that no longer survive. These signs are not empty because we cannot fully read them. They are evidence of a deep human need to make memory more stable than breath. That need grew stronger whenever life became too wide for immediate presence. When people lived by movement, knowledge could remain attached to roots, seasons, bodies, and repeated encounters. When more food was stored, more work was organized, and more obligations stretched across time, memory needed support. But before writing could preserve language in a fuller way, humans used simpler supports. They made reminders. They created marks that pointed toward things. They allowed small objects to stand between the mind and the world. This was a gentle but profound shift. A sign could be seen by more than one person. It could sit still. It could wait. It could help settle a disagreement or call a forgotten duty back into view. Yet it was still dependent on the culture around it, like a key that only works while the lock still exists. This is why modern readers must be careful. If we call every ancient mark writing, we make the past seem clearer than it is. If we call them meaningless, we miss the intelligence behind them. The better path is slower. These marks belong to the long human effort to keep experience from dissolving. They show that before writing became language on a surface, it was already memory leaning toward matter. At the origin of our species, the body was enough for many kinds of knowledge because the world was carried through practice. But as human worlds grew, the body asked for help. A line, a token, a shape, a seal, or an image could not speak fully. Still, each one made forgetting a little less powerful, and made the silent ground beneath writing a little more prepared. The movement from scattered signs to writing was not a single dawn. It was more like a shoreline changing under slow water, with one form touching another until the border became difficult to see. A mark first helps memory, Then a mark begins to stand for a thing. Later, several marks can be arranged so that another person, at another time, may recover the intended meaning with less help from the original speaker. That shift is small in appearance, but enormous in consequence. It means memory is no longer only a living event between people. It begins to become a system. A system can be taught. It can be repeated. It can travel from one hand to another. It can outlast the moment that created it. But early writing did not arrive fully formed, as if someone suddenly decided to place human speech on clay. It grew through many practical pressures, especially in communities where goods, labor, land, and time had to be organized beyond the reach of ordinary recall. At the beginning of human life, knowledge had belonged to bodies moving through a known world. A path was remembered by walking it. A tool was remembered by making it. A warning was remembered because a voice carried it to those nearby. Pre-writing signs kept that older pattern, but slowly changed its shape. They still needed shared understanding, yet they made memory more visible, more durable, and less dependent on one person standing in the right place. The slow move toward writing may have passed through counting objects, impressed marks, sealed containers, labels, pictorial signs, and repeated administrative habits. None of these alone explains the whole story. Together, they show a human world learning to fix relationships between things. A sign and a sheep, a mark and a measure, a name and a person, a number and an obligation. Once those relationships became stable enough, a person did not have to reinvent the meaning every time. Another trained person could see the sign and understand what it was meant to hold. That is when memory begins to become public in a new way. It is not only remembered by a family or a witness. It is stored in a pattern that belongs to a broader institution, a household, a temple, a storehouse, or a town. Still, even then, writing was not one thing everywhere. It changed with material, need, and language. Clay invited pressing and drying. Stone invited carving. Wood, fibre, and skin may have carried signs that rarely survived. The oldest surviving evidence is therefore not the whole beginning, only the part that time allowed to remain. This is a necessary caution. What we can see may depend as much on preservation as on invention. Some human groups may have used perishable supports that vanished without leaving a clear trace. Others may have had rich oral systems and memory practices that never became writing at all. The story is not that writing made humans intelligent. It is that some societies developed a tool for a particular kind of remembering. At the origin of our species, the mind solved problems through attention, imitation, and shared life. Writing added a second layer, a quiet structure outside the body that could hold certain facts steady. The transition took generations because people had to learn not only how to make marks, but how to trust them, teach them, standardize them, and read them as more than private reminders. A sign becomes writing only when it joins a wider agreement. Without that agreement, clay is only clay, marks are only marks, and the past remains locked inside the vanished habits of the people who once understood them. This is why early writing feels unfinished to us. We are not simply missing signs. We are missing the living world that made the signs obvious. Between the rivers that modern people call the Tigris and the Euphrates, memory found a material that could outlast breath. The land of southern Mesopotamia was not easy in a simple way. It was shaped by water that could nourish fields, shift channels, flood, withdraw, and leave people dependent on careful timing. In that broad alluvial plain, stone was not abundant everywhere, and forests were not the ordinary material of daily record-keeping. What the land offered in great quantity was mud, reed, water, sun, and clay. These things may seem humble, but they mattered. Clay could be gathered, softened, shaped, marked, dried, and sometimes baked by accident or intention. It did not require rare tools to receive a sign. A reed could press into it. A hand could hold it. A small tablet could sit in a storeroom after the voice that ordered it was gone. This environment did not force writing to appear, because no river, soil, or climate writes by itself. But it created conditions in which a growing human world could ask matter to remember. Farming communities in this region had to think with the seasons. Water had to be guided, fields had to be worked, grain had to be gathered, and stored food had to be protected from loss. At the deep beginning of human life, the body moved through landscapes and carried knowledge in memory, where water might lie, how animals moved, how plants returned, how danger sounded in the dark. In southern Mesopotamia, much later, some of that ancient attention was turned towards settled work. Instead of remembering only a path or a hunting ground, people had to remember canals, fields, storehouses, herds, rations, labor groups, and repeated obligations. The landscape made cooperation necessary, and cooperation made memory heavier. Water did not arrive in neat human measures. It had to be watched, shared, and managed. Grain did not remain safely in the field. It had to be cut, moved, counted, stored, and later distributed. Once food and work gathered around temples, households, and early urban centers, the old human reliance on spoken memory was placed under pressure. A village can remember through faces. A larger town begins to need records that can stand outside any single face. Mesopotamia became important not because people there were the first humans to think symbolically, but because many practical forces met in one place. Dense settlement, agriculture, exchange, administration, and a material that could receive marks and survive. Clay was especially suited to a slow revolution in memory. It could hold numbers, signs, impressions, and seals. It could be reused while soft or preserved when dry. It could make an agreement visible without turning that agreement into a story. When a tablet recorded grain, animals, labor, or offerings, it was not describing every human life behind those things. It was fixing one thin thread from a wider world. At the origin of our species, memory had been living and social, carried from elder to child, worker to learner, watcher to companion. The clay tablet changed that relationship. It allowed a thought to wait without a body. It allowed a record to sit quietly in a room while people slept, aged, argued, moved away, or died. Cities deepened the need for this stillness. More people meant more names. More stores meant more counting. More institutions meant more duties that had to be remembered after the moment of speech. The rivers gave fertility, but also uncertainty. The mud gave material, but also a place for signs. The fields gave abundance, but abundance itself created problems of tracking and trust. In this way, Mesopotamia did not simply produce writing as an invention. It gathered the pressures that made writing useful and offered clay as the surface on which a larger human memory could begin to settle, where durable records could endure beyond the fragile circle of spoken human recall alone. Clay became a strange kind of memory because it belonged to ordinary ground. It was not rare like metal, not distant like stone brought from far hills, and not as fragile as leaves, bark, cloth, or skin. In southern Mesopotamia, people could take wet earth, mix it, smooth it, and make a small surface ready for pressure. A reed stylus could leave a wedge, a line, a curve, or an impression. A hand could turn the tablet, press another sign, and then let the sun do what the human body could not do, make the moment harder to erase. While soft, clay was forgiving. A mistake could be smoothed away. A record no longer needed could be reshaped. But once dried, and especially once fired by heat, clay could become stubborn. It could wait inside ruins, under fallen walls, beneath dust, long after the people who understood it had disappeared. This is one reason the earliest writing reaches us so strongly through Mesopotamia. It is not because all early human memory became clay. It is because clay happened to survive. At the beginning of human life, memory survived by being repeated through living bodies. A warning, a name, a route, or a method had to move from one person to another before death or distance broke the chain. Clay created another chain. It allowed a record to remain even when no one was speaking. That change was quiet, but it touched the deepest limit of human memory. A spoken number vanishes unless someone holds it. A clay number can sit still. A spoken promise depends on witnesses. A sealed tablet can keep pointing toward an agreement after the room is empty. The material shaped the writing itself. Because clay receives pressure, early signs could be impressed rather than painted. Because small tablets could be held in the palm, records could be brief, practical, and portable within the spaces that used them. Because clay could take seal impressions, it could connect a record with authority, ownership, or a controlled act. In some cases, small objects and signs could be enclosed, sealed, or marked in ways that made counting and verification more stable. These were not modern documents, and they should not be imagined as open books. They were working objects inside working systems. A tablet could belong to a storehouse, a household, a temple institution, a field account, or a movement of goods. It did not need to explain itself to us thousands of years later. It only needed to make sense to the people trained to use it. That is why clay is both generous and severe. It preserves marks, but not always context. It keeps the surface, but not the voice. It may preserve a list of grain or animals, while the hands that harvested, carried, cooked, guarded, or counted them remain almost invisible. From the origin of our species, the human body had been the first archive, the eye remembering a path, the hand remembering a craft, the ear remembering a story, the group remembering who could be trusted. Clay did not replace that living archive. It narrowed one stream of it and made it durable. It favoured what could be counted, labelled, sealed, and checked. It was poor at preserving a tone of voice, a private fear, a tired worker's silence, or the full meaning of a custom everyone then understood without explanation. This is why the oldest writing can feel unfinished even when the signs are visible. The clay survived, but the world around the clay did not survive in the same way. What remains is a hard little surface holding fragments of a larger life. The earth remembered the marks, while time carried away much of the world that made those marks obvious. The earliest clay tablets do not look like the beginning of a literary world. They look more like the remains of a society already carrying too much to remember by voice alone. Many of them are small, practical, and restrained. They hold signs for quantities, commodities, places, offices, or people whose full lives are no longer visible. To a modern reader, this can feel almost empty. There may be no clear story, no personal confession, no complete sentence that opens a human heart. Yet that emptiness is misleading. A record of grain implies fields, seasons, labour, storage, hunger, planning, and distribution. A mark for animals implies herds, movement, breeding, ownership, loss, and counting. A tablet naming workers or rations implies a world where human bodies were organised through repeated tasks, and where food moved through systems larger than a single household. The first tablets did not create that complexity. They reveal that complexity had already arrived. At the beginning of our species, human knowledge had been close to immediate survival. The mind remembered where to walk, what to avoid, how to read a face, how to copy a skilled hand, how to return to a safe place. In the early cities of southern Mesopotamia, the same ancient mind was living inside a different scale. It had to follow goods that moved through storehouses, obligations that stretched across seasons, and names that belonged to people who might never all stand together in one circle. This is why early writing feels like a doorway opened only halfway. The marks show that a social machine was already moving, but they do not show every person inside it. They show the edge of administration, not the warmth of ordinary speech. They tell us that something was counted, but not always how it felt to carry it. They tell us that something was owed, but not always what kind of relationship stood behind the obligation. When writing becomes visible, society is not beginning from silence. It is already layered with farming, craft, trade, authority, storage, and trained memory. Some people had to know how to make and read signs. Others had to trust those signs, or at least live under the decisions they supported. A tablet could sit between a worker and a ration, between a herd and a keeper, between a storehouse and a person responsible for its contents. It made human responsibility more durable, but also more distant. At the origin of human life, responsibility had often depended on presence. Someone saw, someone heard, someone remembered. With tablets, a record could remain even when the witness was gone. That was useful, but it also changed the nature of memory. It allowed institutions to remember in ways that individuals could not. A temple household, a palace economy, or an urban administration could gather many small facts and hold them beyond the limits of one body. The oldest writing therefore describes a world before us not because it tells a complete tale of a forgotten civilization, but because it preserves the working surface of a society whose deeper voices are mostly lost. What survives is not the whole room, only the clay left on the floor. Still, from that clay, we can sense the shape of the room. There were measures people understood, goods people valued, roles people repeated, and rules people expected others to recognize. The tablets are not mysterious because they prove something impossible. They are mysterious because they are partial. They show order without giving us all the meanings behind order. They show that before writing became a way to preserve stories, it was already serving a world of fields, hands, stores, and obligations too wide for memory to hold alone. The oldest surviving records from southern Mesopotamia often speak with the voice of daily management. They do not open with a hero crossing a desert, or a king telling his life, or a sacred poem explaining the sky. Many of them point instead toward grain, animals, jars, textiles, workers, rations, fields, and quantities that had to be counted with care. This can feel strangely cold, because the modern mind expects the first writing to begin with wonder. But the earliest tablets remind us that human societies often preserve what they most urgently need to control. A basket of barley, a flock of sheep, a measure of oil, a group of labourers, a delivery made at the right time. These were not small matters to the people living inside that world. They were the structure of survival. Before writing could become a tool for literature, law, royal memory, or long reflection, it worked close to the storehouse. It made food, work, and obligation visible. At the deep beginning of human life, long before fields and tablets, the body had read the world through movement. Hunger led the feet toward remembered places. Eyes searched for signs of animals or ripe plants. Hands learned by repeating what older hands had done. But in the early urban world, food no longer existed only as something found or prepared for a nearby group. It could be grown in large quantities, gathered, stored, allocated, transported, and owed. Once food became a managed resource, memory had to follow it through many stages. Barley is important here not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet and essential. It could feed people, support workers, become a measure of value, and move through institutions. A tablet that records barley may appear dry, yet behind it stands a whole chain of human activity. Soil prepared, water guided, seed sown, grain cut, grain carried, grain measured, grain stored, grain given out. The tablet does not describe all of that, but it could not exist without it. Livestock records carry the same hidden depth. A sign linked to sheep or cattle may lead us toward herding, breeding, counting, loss, exchange, wool, milk, meat, ritual use, or responsibility. The record fixes a number, but the life behind the number was moving, breathing, and vulnerable. Labour records are perhaps even more human, though they may seem impersonal. When early writing counts workers or rations, it shows that bodies were being organised by systems larger than memory within a family. People worked, received food, carried loads, built, harvested, cleaned, shaped, guarded, and moved through duties that someone had to track. At the origin of our species, work had been learned through shared presence and direct need. In these early cities, work also entered a recorded order. Someone could be counted even when that person's own voice was not preserved. Someone could receive a ration, owe labour, or belong to a listed group, while the tablet held only the administrative trace. Those small signs became calm anchors inside a crowded social world, keeping ordinary acts from dissolving before anyone could compare them later. This is why the ordinary character of early writing matters so much. It does not make the past smaller. It shows how deep the practical foundations of history were. The first records did not need to explain what love felt like, what a child feared at night, or what an old person remembered from youth. They were made to keep goods from disappearing into confusion, to make quantities stable, to hold responsibilities in place. In doing so, they preserved the working skeleton of a society and left much of its living flesh outside the record. The oldest writing, therefore, does not introduce us to humanity through grand speech. It introduces us through what had to be counted, because without counting, the world people had built might not have held together. There is a quiet paradox in the oldest writing that has survived. The farther we look back toward the first readable marks, the less they often sound like a beginning meant for us. They do not greet us with a full human voice. They do not tell us what it felt like to wake before dawn beside a river, to hear animals in the distance, to worry about a hungry season, or to remember the dead. They often give us something much colder: a quantity, a commodity, a name, a delivery, a ration, a responsibility. The earliest memory fixed in writing is therefore not a great speech about being human. It is an account. It is a small effort to keep order from slipping away. That should not disappoint us. It should slow us down. Because if the oldest written traces are ordinary, then ordinariness itself becomes evidence. It tells us that before people wrote myths in lasting form, before they preserved hymns, law collections, royal inscriptions, or literature, there was already a world dense enough to need records. The silence of these tablets is not empty. It is the silence of work already done, food already stored, animals already counted, and human lives already arranged inside systems older than the surviving words that describe them. At the origin of our species, memory was not made for ledgers. It was shaped by living needs, remembering faces, dangers, routes, gestures, tools, kin, water, and seasons. A human mind could hold a rich story because stories carry emotion, rhythm, and image. But lists are different. Lists are dry. They ask the brain to preserve sameness without the help of feeling. 20 jars must remain 20 jars. 3 workers must not become 4. A measure of barley must not change simply because the speaker is tired, the listener distracted, or the witness absent. In this way, the dullness of early writing reveals a deep human problem. The things that mattered most to survival in a growing settled society were not always the things easiest to remember. A poem can live in the chest. A number often needs a surface. A family story may be held by affection. A stored harvest may require a mark that cannot be persuaded by mood or time. The ancient tablet seems silent because it usually refuses to explain the life around it. It may say that grain moved, but not whose hands lifted it. It may show that labour was counted, but not whether the worker was young, old, willing, weary, hungry, proud, or afraid. It may preserve a name, while leaving the face completely gone. This is why the oldest writing can feel like a window covered by dust. We can see outlines through it, but not the full room. The ordinary record stands between us and a vanished world. It lets us know that the world existed, yet it does not let the world speak fully. That is the colder side of preservation. Writing saved what early institutions needed to keep stable, but it did not save everything humans needed to feel alive. It saved the number more easily than the voice, the duty more easily than the private thought, the distribution more easily than the shared meal. And so the first writing becomes almost more haunting because it is not dramatic. It shows us that history begins in writing, not with the whole human being, but with selected traces of human activity. Behind each quiet sign there may have been weather, hunger, gossip, fatigue, skill, trust, and conflict. But the tablet gives only the narrow record. No. The oldest memory on earth is ordinary, because ordinary life was already too large to hold without help. The first written records seem to begin in the middle of things. They do not pause to introduce the world that made them. They do not explain why a certain measure mattered, why a certain person was named, why a certain storehouse needed attention, or why a group of workers received food on one day and not another. They behave as if everyone who mattered already understood the background. That is one of their most important clues. A tablet made for accounting was not trying to teach distant descendants about Mesopotamian society. It was made inside a living order that already knew its rules. The signs were useful because the world around them supplied the missing meaning. A mark for grain made sense, because grain was already being planted, harvested, measured, stored, exchanged, and distributed. A mark for animals made sense because herds were already being watched, divided, valued, and claimed. A mark linked with labour made sense because people were already moving through organised duties. The page did not create that world. It entered it late enough to show that many relationships had already become stable, repeated, and socially understood. At the origin of human life, meaning had always depended on shared presence. A gesture made sense because others knew the task. A warning call mattered because the group knew the danger. A path became knowledge because feet returned to it across seasons. Early writing kept that older dependence on shared understanding, but it placed a thin, durable layer over it. The tablet could hold a sign, but the society had to know how to read the sign, trust it, and fit it into practice. This means that every ordinary tablet points backward. It points to habits older than itself, institutions already active, measures already accepted, and people already trained to connect marks with goods and responsibilities. The oldest writing therefore describes a world before us not by telling a full story, but by assuming one. Its silence is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a system that did not need to explain itself to those who lived inside it. Modern readers stand outside that system. We see the marks, but not always the daily certainty that once surrounded them. We may understand that a quantity was recorded, yet not fully understand the social moment that made the record necessary. Was it routine distribution, storage control, ritual offering, labor management, or something more specific to a local practice now lost? Careful scholarship can answer many things, but it cannot return every vanished custom, every spoken instruction, every shared assumption. This is why the most ordinary tablets can feel so deep. They show society at work beneath the surface of writing. They show that people had already built a world where objects moved through rules, where food could be separated from the hands that produced it, where authority could depend on records, where memory had become something managed. At the beginning of our species, memory was close to the body, a face, a path, a tool, a seasonal return. In the early written world, memory began to stretch across storehouses, offices, fields and groups too large for one circle of speech. Yet the first mark still rested on human trust. Someone had to shape the clay. Someone had to make the sign correctly. Someone had to know the value behind it. Someone had to accept that the silent object could speak for a past action. Behind the tablet there was always a living world, and behind that living world there were older human abilities. Attention, imitation, cooperation, memory, and the need to keep order against forgetting. The ordinary record, then, is not a small beginning. It is evidence that by the time writing appears, society has already crossed an invisible threshold, where life has become too layered to remain only in the human mind. When the first clay records come down to us, they do not arrive as a complete map of a civilization. They arrive as fragments, each one holding a narrow trace of something that once belonged to a much larger world. A tablet may record a quantity of grain, but it does not show the field in sunlight, the muddy canal edge, the aching hands that cut the stalks, or the worry of a season that might fail. Another tablet may preserve a name, but not the sound of that name when spoken by a mother, a child, a neighbour, or a tired official at the end of a long day. This is the strange condition of the oldest writing. It gives us evidence, but evidence is not the same as wholeness. A record can be true and still incomplete. A sign can be readable and still leave the life around it in shadow. The world before us, held in early writing, is therefore not a lost continent suddenly revealed. It is a broken surface where small administrative facts survived while most living context disappeared. That is why careful thinking matters. The oldest writing should not be forced to say more than it can say. It should be listened to for what it actually preserves: movements of goods, measures, names, duties, institutions, repeated habits, and the quiet pressure of keeping order. At the beginning of human life, memory had been woven into presence. People knew by seeing, doing, hearing, returning, copying, and repeating. Knowledge was not divided from the living world around it. But once writing began to hold selected facts outside the body, the future inherited those selected facts more easily than the full experience behind them. Time favoured clay more than breath. It favoured a number more than a conversation. It favoured the mark of a transaction more than the inner life of the people involved. This does not make the tablets poor witnesses. It makes them honest witnesses of a limited kind. They tell us that society was organised, that resources were counted, that labour and responsibility could be tracked, and that some people had learned to place memory into signs. But they rarely tell us the full emotional weather of that society. They do not always explain whether an action was routine, sacred, pressured, generous, unequal, expected, or disputed. Sometimes the missing context is exactly what we most want to know. We can see that something happened, but not always why it mattered in the minds of those who lived through it. A list of rations may show distribution, but not the conversation that followed. A seal impression may show authority, but not the person who hesitated before accepting it. A place name may anchor a record, but not the smell of the street, the sound of animals, or the feeling of heat rising from the ground. At the origin of our species, so much human meaning lived in bodies and moments that left little durable trace. Early writing captured only certain thin lines from that wide human field. It is like finding a few dry reeds from a riverbank, and knowing there was once water, mud, insects, footsteps, and voices nearby, even if the river itself has moved away. The fragments are precious because they survived, but their survival can mislead us if we mistake them for the whole. The oldest writing describes a world before us by leaving us with what that world chose, or needed, to record. Around those records lies the greater silence. All the meals not listed, all the memories never pressed into clay, all the meanings that were obvious then and uncertain now. A modern reader can stand before an ancient tablet and feel very close to another human being, because the surface still carries marks made by a hand. The clay may show a name, a number, a commodity, a place, or a sign linked to labour, storage, or movement. Something was once important enough to be recorded, and the mark survived. Yet closeness is not the same as understanding. A name can remain without a biography. A number can remain without the hunger, pressure, duty, or trust behind it. A jar of oil can be counted, but the reason it mattered on that day may have vanished with the people who understood the rule. This is one of the deepest limits of early writing. It gives modern minds small, hard facts, but not always the living connections between them. We may read that grain was delivered, animals were counted, or workers received rations, yet the wider human scene is often missing. Was the delivery ordinary or urgent? Was the count connected to a festival, a tax, a redistribution, a temple routine, or a local habit whose meaning no longer survives? Careful study can narrow the possibilities, but the tablet rarely becomes a full voice. It often remains more like a footprint at the edge of a vanished settlement, proof that someone passed there, but not a complete account of where they were going or what they felt as they walked. At the beginning of human life, meaning was learned inside shared experience. People did not need to explain every rule because the rule lived in repeated action. A young person learned when to gather, where to walk, how to shape a tool, how to read a face, and when to be silent by living among others. Early writing still depended on that kind of shared background. The signs were not made for strangers thousands of years away. They were made for people who already knew the measuring systems, the goods, the offices, the habits, and the local expectations. Time has kept the tablet but removed much of the shared world around it. That is why a translated sign may still feel unfinished. Translation can turn a sign into a word, but it cannot always restore the whole human situation that made the word obvious. When we see a personal name, we may not know whether that person was a scribe, worker, official, owner, dependent, stranger, or someone mentioned only because an institution needed to remember them. When we see a quantity, we may not know whether it meant wealth, survival, obligation, punishment, generosity, or routine balance. When we see an object, we may not know the smell of it, the labour behind it, or the social value attached to it by the people who touched it. The oldest writing, therefore, asks us to hold two truths together. The evidence is real, and the evidence is incomplete. It is not honest to pretend the gaps are filled simply because the marks look clear. At the origin of our species, human memory was rich because it was embodied. It carried tone, gesture, place, rhythm, and relationship. Writing preserved selected pieces of that richness by making them durable, but durability came with narrowing. A tablet could save the name and lose the face. It could save the amount and lose the argument. It could save the item and lose the room in which it changed hands. It could remain for centuries while the song, the joke, the anger, the prayer, or the simple tired breath around that exchange disappeared. What reaches us is not a finished story, but a pattern of surviving clues. The ancient world is present in those clues, yet it remains half hidden behind them, like a quiet voice heard through a wall of clay. The world before us was not a hidden civilization waiting beneath the oldest writing with a complete story written for modern eyes. It was something quieter and more difficult to recover. It was the ordinary world that existed around the first records. The rooms where clay was shaped, the fields where grain grew, the the paths where animals moved, the hands that carried baskets, the people who understood rules that no tablet bothered to explain. When the title speaks of a world before us, the safest meaning is not a lost empire beyond evidence. It is the world that came before our ability to see it clearly through writing. Early texts do not give that world as a full picture. They give the hard edges that survived after the softer meanings were worn away. A list can tell us that barley was counted, but it cannot bring back the exact heat of the field. A name can remain, but not the voice that answered to it. A seal can show that authority touched an object, but not the quiet fear, trust, habit, or obedience that may have surrounded the act. At the origin of human life, meaning was never stored in signs alone. It lived in the body and in the group, in repeated gestures, shared labour, remembered places, and customs learned without needing to be written down. Early writing entered that living fabric late, and it captured only what certain people needed to make stable. That is why it is easy to misunderstand the silence. A gap in the record is not proof of a secret. It is often only the natural result of time. Most voices were never written. Most objects decayed. Most meanings belong to situations that disappeared when the people who knew them were gone. What remains on clay is therefore both precious and narrow. It can show administration, exchange, storage, duty, and sometimes names or places. It cannot, by itself, restore an entire living society in all its emotional and social depth. The phrase, "no one can finish translating," should be understood with the same care. It does not mean that every mark is unreadable, or that scholars have failed completely. Many signs and many texts can be studied with great care. But translation is more than matching a sign to a word. It also asks us to rebuild the lost room around the word. A written sign may be legible while its full use remains uncertain. A term may have several possible meanings. A name may be preserved without telling us who the person was. A record may be translated in a narrow sense while the human situation behind it remains unfinished. At the beginning of our species, knowledge passed through closeness. An elder showing a child, a worker copying a hand movement, a group remembering a place because they returned to it together. Once writing began to survive beyond that closeness, it allowed future people to read traces without belonging to the community that made them clear. That is the deep distance inside ancient writing. We inherit the marks, but not the whole world of assumptions that made the marks ordinary. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it points to life that was already organized, remembered, and meaningful before it became visible on clay. Yet it also reminds us that visibility is not completeness. To read these records honestly is to accept a boundary. We can learn from what survived, but we must not turn every silence into mystery, or every missing context into a dramatic claim. The truer wonder is karma. Human beings made signs to save memory, and those signs crossed thousands of years, but the life around them still receded. What remains is not a finished translation of the past, but a patient invitation to understand how much of any human world lives outside the words that survive. To translate the oldest writing is not only to identify marks, it is to enter a damaged system of life. A sign pressed into clay may have a known shape, a known sound, or a known connection with grain, sheep, labour, or a place. But meaning does not live in shape alone. Meaning depends on the world that used the sign. It depends on measures, customs, offices, routines, social ranks, local habits, and the kinds of silence that everyone inside the community understood without needing to explain. This is why translation can remain unfinished, even when many signs are no longer mysterious. Reading a mark is one task. Rebuilding the human situation around the mark is another. A tablet may say that a quantity moved from one place to another, yet the deeper meaning of that movement may depend on a seasonal practice, a temple routine, an administrative formula, a legal expectation, or a relationship now only partly visible. The oldest writing did not exist to teach outsiders across thousands of years. It existed inside a working world. It assumed readers who already knew the system. At the beginning of human life, knowledge was learned through closeness. A child learned a tool by watching hands. A young person learned a path by walking with others. A warning, a song, or a rule lived in tone, timing, and repetition. Writing changed that pattern by letting marks outlive the people who knew how to use them, but it could not carry the whole living setting with equal strength. That is why ancient translation is never just a puzzle of signs. It is also a careful reconstruction of vanished context. The scholar must ask what language stands behind the mark, what period the tablet belongs to, how signs change through time, whether the text is administrative, lexical, ritual, legal, or literary, and whether the same sign had more than one use. A single sign might represent an object, a sound, an idea, a name, a title, or a conventional formula depending on its position and setting. A word may be readable but still uncertain in force. It may name a profession we cannot fully picture, a container whose exact size is debated, a commodity prepared in a way no longer practiced, or an institution whose inner workings are only partly known. None of this means the past is unknowable. It means that honest knowledge has edges. At the origin of our species, memory was rich because it carried more than information. It carried gesture, place, relationship, and need. Early writing preserved information better than breath could, but it often preserved it in a reduced form. A translator today may recover the surface message while still losing the human thickness around it. The tablet may tell that rations were issued, but not the expression on the receiver's face. It may preserve a title, but not the full authority people felt when they heard it spoken. It may keep a place name, but not the sound of that place in daily life. Translation, therefore, moves between two kinds of evidence: the material sign that survived and the missing world that made the sign natural. The difficulty is not only age, it is the separation between record and life. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it was made inside a world that did not expect us. We can learn its marks, compare tablets, study languages, and rebuild patterns with patience. But the final layer is often not a hidden sentence waiting to be unlocked. It is the lost common sense of a vanished community, the ordinary background that once made every sign feel clear. Ancient signs do not remain frozen just because clay survives. A mark that looks stable to the eye may have moved through many uses while people were still using it. In one setting, it could point to an object. In another, it could help write a sound. In another, it could belong to a name, a title, a place, or a fixed administrative phrase. Over centuries, signs could become simpler, sharper, more wedge-shaped, or more conventional as hands repeated them and scribes learned them through training. This movement creates a quiet difficulty for translation. The sign is not only a shape, it is a shape inside time. To understand it, one must ask when it was written, where it was written, what kind of record it belonged to, and what surrounding signs are doing. A symbol that seems clear in one tablet may become uncertain in another because the context has shifted. This is not failure. It is what happens when living systems leave hard traces behind. Human language itself changes while people use it. Words widen, narrow, soften, disappear, or take on new force. Writing systems do something similar. They carry older habits forward, but they also bend under new needs. A sign may begin close to a thing that can be seen, then later serve as a sound, then survive in formulas where its original image matters very little. By the time a modern reader meets it, the mark may hold a history of uses layered inside one small impression. At the beginning of human life, meaning was learned through presence, not through fixed dictionaries. A sound mattered because a group knew when to use it. A gesture mattered because bodies shared the task. A trail mattered because feet had followed it before. Early writing inherited that dependence on shared practice. Even when marks became more standardized, they still belong to trained communities whose habits are not fully recoverable. This is why the same sign can ask several questions at once. Is it being read as a word, as a sound, as a number, as a professional title, as a divine name, or as a conventional shortcut? Is the tablet damaged? Is the surface worn? Is the sign copied from an older model? Is it local, formal, careless, or deliberately abbreviated? The translator does not simply choose the most interesting answer. The translator must compare evidence, accept limits, and sometimes leave uncertainty visible. That uncertainty is one reason no one can finish translating the oldest writing in a complete human sense. Many tablets can be read well enough to understand their immediate function, yet the total meaning remains thinner than the original world. A measure may be known, but not exactly equal to a modern measure. A job title may be readable but not fully matched to a lived role. A place may be named but not securely located. A commodity may be listed, but its preparation, quality, social meaning, or ritual setting may remain unclear. At the origin of our species, memory included the body, the face, the tone, the shared ground beneath speech. Clay preserved the sign, but not all those surrounding layers. Changes across time make the distance wider. The mark we see may have passed through generations of scribal habit before it reached the tablet that survived. Each generation understood more than it wrote down, because no living culture writes every assumption it carries. So ancient writing becomes both evidence and horizon. It allows us to read farther than speech alone would have allowed, but it also shows where reading stops. The more patiently we study the signs, the clearer their edges become, and the more we notice the lost world around those edges. What remains is not confusion for its own sake, but the honest texture of an ancient system whose meanings were alive before they became archaeological traces in silent clay today. Even when a tablet can be read sign by sign, something can still remain beyond translation. The marks may identify grain, animals, labour, names, places or duties, and the order of the record may be clear enough to understand its practical use. Yet the tablet once belonged to a living moment. Someone pressed the clay while standing within a room. An institution, a custom, and a language shaped by voices now gone. Reading the signs can recover the skeleton of meaning, but the flesh around that skeleton is harder to restore. A modern translation may say that barley was issued, sheep were counted, or workers received rations. It may be accurate as far as the signs allow. Still, it cannot always return the tone of command, the reason for urgency, the social weight of a title, or the ordinary assumption that made the record obvious to its first reader. This is the difference between decoding and understanding. Decoding brings the mark into a known range. Understanding asks how that mark lived among people. At the beginning of human life, knowledge did not separate itself from the body. A rule was learned by watching others follow it. A place was known through walking. A tool was remembered by the rhythm of making it. A warning carried meaning through sound, face, and circumstance. Early writing preserved selected facts, but it did not preserve all those layers equally. It froze some fragments of memory and let others remain dependent on the vanished world around them. That is why a successful reading can still feel incomplete. A sign may be translated as a profession, but the actual daily work may have included tasks no word now fully restores. A commodity may be named, but its exact quality, use, smell, preparation, or value in a particular setting may remain uncertain. A place may appear in a record, yet the streets, fields, paths, and human movements around that place may be only partly known. The tablet gives evidence. It does not give the whole life. This limit is not a weakness to hide. It is part of intellectual honesty. The oldest writing should not be treated as a locked treasure chest that will eventually open into a complete story if only one final key is found. Some losses are not hidden. They are gone. The material survived, but the living context did not survive in the same form. At the origin of our species, memory was broad because it was social. It included who spoke, who listened, who trusted whom, what had happened before, and what everyone already understood without explanation. Written marks reduced that broad field into durable signals. They allowed certain things to cross time, but the crossing was narrow. Each tablet is therefore both a bridge and a boundary. It carries meaning from an ancient hand toward a modern eye, yet it also shows where the ancient world refuses to become fully present. Even a perfect transcription cannot restore every missing gesture. Even a careful translation cannot make a vanished custom breathe again in its original air. What remains is enough to learn from, but not enough to possess completely. This matters for the title's central question. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it records selected pieces of a society already old, already organized, already full of meanings not made for us. No one can finish translating it completely because translation ends at the edge of surviving context. Beyond that edge are the unwritten things, the shared habits, remembered voices, local measures, work routines, fears, jokes, fatigue, trust, and everyday knowledge that once made the marks feel simple. That absence is quiet, but it is the reason these records feel open, as if clay kept the mark while time kept the rest hidden. The signs are still here, but the ordinary world that completed them has mostly moved beyond reach. Before writing came close to recording speech, many early signs seem to have stayed near things that could be counted, seen, stored, or moved. A mark could stand beside grain, sheep, jars, textiles, workers, or land, not because it carried a full spoken sentence, but because it helped a community hold a practical relationship still. This is important because modern readers often imagine writing as language placed directly onto a surface. But the earliest systems did not need to begin by capturing every sound of the human voice. They could begin by connecting a sign with a thing, a number with a commodity, a mark with a duty, or a symbol with a remembered category. A tablet did not have to say everything. It only had to say enough for trained people inside the same world to understand what should be counted, checked, moved, or remembered. In that sense, early writing was still close to the older world of signs and objects. It leaned toward visible things before it leaned fully toward spoken language. At the beginning of human life, knowledge was tied to direct experience. A person knew an animal by its movement, a tool by its use, a plant by its season, a face by repeated presence. Meaning came first through the body and the surrounding world. Early signs grew out of that same human habit. They pointed outward. They were attached to things people could handle, measure, distribute, or recognize. A sign for an animal did not need to describe the animal in a poetic way. It could serve a practical memory. A sign for grain did not need to tell the story of the harvest. It could hold a quantity steady inside a system of storage. A mark linked with labor did not need to preserve a worker's voice. It could show that a human body had been counted within an organized task. This is why early writing often feels narrow to us. It preserves the categories that administration needed before it preserves the full flow of speech. Yet that narrowness is also what made writing useful. The first written signs could reduce a complicated living world into stable units that others could compare. They turned moving reality into something more still. Grain became a counted amount. Animals became a listed group. People became names, roles, or numbers inside an account. The world became less fluid on the tablet than it was in life. At the origin of our species, memory had always handled living complexity through rhythm, story, imitation, and presence. Early writing took a different path. It made memory dry enough to be stored. It did not need to carry tone, emotion, or full grammar in order to change history. It only needed to make certain meanings durable. Over time, this practical beginning created space for larger possibilities. Once a sign could stand for a thing, and once signs could be repeated and taught, they could begin to move toward more flexible uses. A mark might first point to an object, then become associated with a word for that object, and later help represent sound in another context. But that movement was gradual. The oldest writing did not leap immediately into complete speech. It passed through a long middle ground where sign, object, number, and spoken language overlapped unevenly. This is one reason translation remains delicate. Some marks may be clear as categories, yet uncertain as language. Some records may show what was counted without giving a full sentence. Some signs may carry meanings that were obvious to early users but appear thin to us because we're missing the living system around them. The earliest writing was therefore not a mirror of the whole human voice. It was a tool that began by holding the world's manageable surfaces, things, amounts, duties and names, while much of speech still remained in breath. As signs became more practiced, they began to do something older marks could not easily do. They began to reach towards sound. A sign that once pointed mainly to a visible thing could, in some situations, also help write the spoken word for that thing. From there, it could sometimes be used for a sound within another word. This was a quiet transformation, but it changed the future of writing. A mark no longer had to remain tied to sheep, grain, jars, or fields. It could begin to help record a name, a place, a title, an action, or a word whose meaning could not be held by a picture alone. Human speech contains many things that are not easy to draw. How does one draw owing, receiving, going, giving, remembering, commanding, or belonging? How does one draw a personal name whose meaning matters less than its sound? How does one draw a local place known by everyone nearby, but invisible to anyone outside that world? When writing moved towards sound, it gained a new flexibility. It could step away from the object and approach the voice. At the beginning of human life, voices had carried memory through air. A warning could pass quickly. A name could call someone close. A story could hold a group together through rhythm and repetition. But voice was fragile because it vanished as soon as breath ended. Early writing first held things and quantities, then slowly learned to hold traces of speech. This did not happen evenly or simply. It took trained habits, repeated use, and agreement among people who shared the system. A sign could keep its old meaning in one place and serve a sound in another. Some signs could carry more than one value. Some could be used for whole words, while others helped spell sounds. To the people trained in the system, this flexibility was useful. To later readers, it creates difficulty. The same clay impression may ask whether it is naming a thing, sounding a syllable, marking a category, or joining a formula. Yet this complexity is also the reason writing could grow beyond accounting. Once signs could help carry sound, writing could hold personal names with greater precision. Names matter because they bring the record closer to individual people, even when the person's full life remains hidden. A worker, official, owner, witness, ruler, or place could enter the tablet not only as a role, but as a sequence of sounds recognized by others. Place names also changed the scale of memory. They allowed records to point to landscapes, towns, fields, canals, and institutions beyond the immediate room. Verbs and more complex expressions made the written surface more active. The tablet could begin to record not only what existed, but what was done, given, received, sent, dedicated, measured, or assigned. At the origin of our species, action had been remembered through bodies doing things in view of others. Writing gradually made action durable in another way. It could turn movement into a sign that waited. It could make a past act available to a future reader, though only in the narrow form the system allowed. This movement towards sound did not make writing equal to speech. No tablet could preserve every pause, tone, hesitation, or warmth of a human voice, but it allowed speech to leave a stronger trace than object signs alone could carry. It also allowed memory to move beyond visible things, toward relations, commands, promises, and identities that could not be weighed or stored. The oldest writing, therefore, stands on a threshold. Behind it are objects, measures, storehouses, and counts. Ahead of it are names, places, actions, laws, hymns, stories, and remembered rulers. Between them lies the slow discovery that a sign could point not only to the world outside the mouth, but also to the sounds forming inside it. Writing moved closer to speech, but it never became speech itself. A clay tablet could hold signs for sounds, names, places, and actions, yet it could not hold the full living body of a voice. It could not keep the pressure of breath, the softness of hesitation, the small rise in tone when someone was unsure, or the silence after a difficult command. A written sign could say that something was given, received, owed, counted, or sent, but it could not preserve every human feeling around that act. This is one of the quiet losses inside the invention of writing. The more signs learned to carry sound, the more powerful they became, but also the more clearly they showed what sound itself had once carried. Before writing, language lived in time. A word happened, moved through air, touched another ear, and vanished unless memory kept it alive. At the beginning of human life, speech and gesture belonged to the same living moment. A hand pointed, a face changed, a warning sounded, a child watched, and meaning came from the whole scene, not from words alone. Writing separated one thread from that scene and made it durable. That thread could cross distance and survive death, but it was thinner than the voice from which it came. This is why early writing feels both miraculous and incomplete. It allowed names to remain after bodies were gone. It allowed a place to be named after the traveller had left. It allowed an action to be fixed after the hands that performed it had fallen still. Yet it did not keep laughter, accent, fear, tenderness, fatigue, or the private rhythm of ordinary talk. Even when later writing systems became capable of preserving long sentences, they still could not carry every layer of speech. A tablet might record a hymn, a law, a message, or a royal claim, but the sound of the person who spoke it had already become something else. The living voice had been changed into signs. This change mattered because human memory had always been more than information. It was relationship. A child did not learn only words from an elder. The child learned timing, trust, caution, and attention. A community did not remember only names. It remembered how names were spoken, when they were avoided, and what feelings surrounded them. Early writing brought language closer to matter, but matter could not breathe. At the origin of our species, the body was not simply a container for words. It was the instrument through which meaning arrived. Eyes, hands, posture, breath, nearness, distance, repeated practice. Writing preserved some meanings by cutting them away from that instrument. This cutting made civilization more durable in one sense and more distant in another. It allowed records to travel where voices could not travel, but it also turned living speech into a smaller trace, something readable yet incomplete, lasting yet reduced. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it carries traces of voices that can no longer be heard. We may see a name, but not the mouth that shaped it. We may read an action, but not the tone that made it gentle, harsh, routine, or urgent. We may understand a sign, but not always the living presence that completed it. That is why no translation can truly finish the work. It can bring signs into modern words, and it can do so with discipline, comparison, and care, but it cannot make clay speak again as a human throat once spoke. The first writing gave humanity a memory outside the body, and that memory changed the course of history. Yet what it saved was never the whole voice. It was a shadow of speech, firm enough to endure, narrow enough to remind us that much of the human past was never written, only spoken, heard, and lost. Behind the oldest writing were not only signs, tablets, and systems. There were people whose bodies made the records possible. A clay tablet did not shape itself. Someone gathered the clay, prepared it, held it, pressed signs into it, checked it, stored it, or carried it to a place where it mattered. Around that person stood many others, workers in fields, keepers of animals, makers of jars, handlers of textiles, people who brought goods in, people who received food, people who watched doorways, measured grain, moved baskets, or waited for a ration. The first written records often make these lives appear small because they reduce them to names, roles, quantities, or duties. Yet every dry sign points back to human movement. A number of sheep implies hands guiding animals through dust or mud. A measure of barley implies backs bending over fields, feet walking near canals, mouths depending on stored food. A list of workers implies bodies gathered under authority, not simply abstract units on a surface. The early tablet may be quiet, but behind it was a crowded human day. At the beginning of our species, knowledge had passed through direct presence. One person watched another. Skill moved from hand to hand. Trust was built by repeated contact, shared danger, and memory held in a living group. In the early written world, that older human pattern did not disappear. It became surrounded by institutions that needed marks to manage what presence alone could no longer hold. The scribe, or trained record maker, stood near this change. Such a person did not merely write in a modern sense. They belonged to an organized environment where signs, numbers, seals, goods, and authority met. Their work made memory more durable, but also more selective. They wrote what the system needed to remember. They did not write every tired breath of the person carrying grain, every private thought of a herder, every small conversation beside a storage room, or every feeling attached to a name. Because of that, the people behind the earliest writing are both visible and hidden. They are visible because their labor created the need for records. They are hidden because the records rarely pause to give them a full human shape. A farmer may stand behind a grain account without being named as a farmer. A herder may stand behind an animal count without leaving a voice. A woman grinding food, a child watching work, An older person remembering an older way of doing things may have lived near the system, yet left no direct mark in it. At the origin of human life, the group remembered through many voices, not only through those closest to power. Writing changed whose memory could cross time most easily. A trained hand close to storage, temple, household, or administration had a greater chance of leaving marks than a person whose knowledge lived only in action. This does not mean the unwritten person was unimportant. It means preservation followed the paths of material, authority, and need. The first writing was built on ordinary labour, but it often preserved labour as an item to be managed rather than a life to be known. That is one reason these records feel calm and distant. They do not shout about suffering or achievement. They simply count, assign, list, and hold. But if we read them slowly, they begin to gather people around them again, not as invented biographies, not as dramatic secrets, but as necessary presences. Every tablet required a world of hands before it could become a record. The oldest writing is therefore not only evidence of signs, it is evidence of human bodies organized around food, animals, work, memory, and the fragile wish to make one day remain understandable to another. Most people behind the earliest writing did not leave stories about themselves. They left shadows inside records that were made for other purposes. A worker may appear only because food was issued. A herder may appear only because animals were counted. A craftsperson may appear only through textiles, jars, tools, or materials that pass through an account. A person's name, if it survives at all, may stand beside a measure, a duty, a delivery, or a stored object, without telling us the person's age, family, fear, skill, or memory. This is not because ordinary people had no lives worth remembering. It is because the earliest writing often served systems that needed to remember goods more clearly than feelings. Clay kept the thing that administration required. Time then kept the clay. Around that narrow survival, the larger human life faded. At the beginning of our species, no person was remembered by tablets. A person was remembered because others knew the sound of their voice, the shape of their walk, the use of their hands, the place they slept, the stories they repeated, and the help they gave or refused. Memory was personal because survival was personal. It lived in nearness. In the early written world, nearness still mattered, but the record began to separate a person from the fullness of their presence. Someone could become a line in an account. Someone's work could cross thousands of years, while their face disappeared almost at once. This creates one of the quietest losses in the history of writing. The record can preserve proof that people were there, but not the whole way they were there. A rationalist may tell us that bodies needed food. It may hint at organized labor, dependence, planning, hierarchy, or routine. But it does not tell us what a worker thought while receiving grain, whether the day was hot, whether the body was tired, whether the exchange felt ordinary, fair, tense, or humiliating. A count of sheep may reveal wealth or responsibility, but not the cold morning, the smell of animals, the sound of hooves, or the patience of the person who watched them. The oldest records are therefore full of people and almost empty of biography. They preserve human presence through things. This should make us careful, not disappointed. If we try to turn every name into a dramatic life, we invent what the evidence cannot support. If we treat the names as only dry data, we forget that every account rested on bodies moving through real days. At the origin of human life, the group carried memory in many directions at once. Elders held old knowledge, children learned through watching, adults coordinated labor, and voices kept relationships alive. Writing changed the path of memory by allowing some traces to survive without the group that once carried them. Yet it favored the traces closest to organized control. Goods remained clearer than grief. Numbers remained clearer than conversations. Roles remained clearer than inner lives. The people who built, harvested, counted, carried, watched, and waited are still present in the earliest writing, but they are present as outlines drawn by necessity. Their personal stories were not finished by translation because they were never fully written down. The clay did not fail them. It simply was not made to hold everything. It held what a storehouse, household, temple, or office needed to keep steady. The rest belonged to voices, gestures, rooms, paths, and shared knowledge that time did not preserve. So when we read the oldest writing, We meet humanity through absence as much as through evidence. We see grain, and behind it hunger. We see numbers, and behind them hands. We see names, and behind them lives that once felt complete to themselves, even though history now receives them only as quiet traces in clay. They are gone, yet not meaningless, because every trace still points toward living people. Writing gave early society a stronger memory, but it did not remember everyone equally. It could hold the movement of grain more firmly than the story of the person who harvested it. It could preserve a name more easily than the voice that once answered to that name. It could keep a number of workers, but not the full weight of each body's day. This is not because the people behind those records were unimportant. It is because writing first served narrow needs. It helped institutions manage goods, labor, offerings, storage, and responsibility. It made society visible as a pattern of accounts, but ordinary lives often entered that pattern only as traces. A person became a name beside a quantity, a role beside a ration, a body counted within a task. The tablet could make the system last while making the individual thinner. At the beginning of human life, memory was not separated from the person so easily. A face, a skill, a gesture, a way of walking, a story repeated at night, a warning spoken beside a fire or a resting place. These were ways a person remained present to others. Memory belonged to relationships. It carried warmth, obligation, affection, fear, and trust. Early writing changed the path of survival for memory. It allowed certain facts to leave those relationships and become durable objects. That was powerful, but it was also selective. The people closest to record-keeping, authority, stores, and administration became easier for history to see. The people whose knowledge lived mainly in hands, backs, voices, and repeated work became harder to recover. This is one reason the oldest writing can feel as if it describes a world before us from above, through its structures rather than through its breathing lives. It shows society, but society is not the same as the people who filled it. A record of textiles may point to spinning, weaving, dyeing, carrying, exchange, and skill, but it may not tell us who learned the craft from whom, who grew tired, who took pride, who worried about food, or who spoke quietly while working. A record of rations may show distribution, but not the taste of the meal or the silence around it. A record of animals may show wealth or duty, but not the long patience of watching living creatures through heat, mud, dust, or night. At the origin of our species, human knowledge had often survived because it stayed close to action. The one who knew the tool could show the tool. The one who knew the path could lead others along it. The one who remembered a danger could speak when the group approached it. Writing allowed knowledge to survive without that person still standing there. Yet when the person disappeared, something was lost from the knowledge itself. The tablet remained, but the teacher was gone. The sign remained, but the shared situation was gone. The account remained, but the lived day dissolved. This does not mean writing made people less human. It means writing preserved humanity unevenly. It made some kinds of order remarkably durable while leaving ordinary feeling, informal speech, and private memory exposed to disappearance. The oldest writing is therefore both a gift and a veil. It gives us evidence that early societies were organized, inventive, and capable of building memory outside the body. At the same time, it covers the unnamed majority with the very system that proves they existed. We see them through grain, animals, jars, textiles, rations, and names, not through their own full voices. The world before us is not only hard to translate because signs are old, it is hard to translate because the people who made that world were often recorded only where society needed them, not where their lives were most complete. When writing became a way to manage resources, it also became a way to manage people. A tablet that recorded grain did more than remember food. It helped decide where food would go, who could receive it, who was responsible for it, and whether an obligation had been met. A record of labor did more than name work. It made human time visible to an institution. A sign for an animal, a field, a jar, or a ration could stand inside a chain of authority that reached beyond the immediate moment. This is one of the great shifts hidden inside early writing. Memory outside the body did not remain neutral. Once a record could outlast speech, it could support claims, settle accounts, organize duties, and make responsibility harder to deny. At the beginning of human life, responsibility often lived close to presence. Someone saw who helped. Someone remembered who shared food, who broke trust, who knew a path, who failed to warn others. Social memory was held by living witnesses. In larger settled societies, witnesses were no longer enough. Grain might enter a storehouse through one group of hands and leave through another. Labor might be owed after a season had passed. Animals might be counted, transferred, lost, or claimed by people who did not all know one another well. The written record gave these relationships a firmer shape. It could say, in a narrow but durable way, that something had been counted, delivered, assigned, or owed. That firmness helped organize life, but it also brought memory closer to power. Whoever controlled records could control how goods were seen, how labor was measured, and how duties were remembered. Writing could make a storehouse more orderly. It could also make the storehouse more commanding. It could protect an agreement. It could also strengthen the hand that defined the agreement. This does not mean early writing was simply oppression, and it should not be reduced to one moral story. It was a tool, and tools take their meaning from the worlds that use them. A record could help prevent confusion, reduce dispute, or keep food available for distribution. It could also bind people into systems they did not fully shape. The same clay surface that preserved a measure of barley could help decide who was fed, who owed work, or who answered for a loss. At the origin of our species, memory had been carried by bodies that depended on one another directly. With writing, some memory began to belong to offices, households, temples, and later states. Institutions could remember beyond the lifespan of any worker, herder, farmer, or official. That new memory gave institutions continuity. It allowed them to gather small facts into a larger order. Ownership could become more stable because a claim could be recorded. Tax, tribute, offering, or distribution could be followed across time because the marks remained. Labor could be counted not only as effort felt in muscles, but as units inside an account. The human body became readable through duty. The field became readable through yield. The animal became readable through number. The household became readable through what it owed or received. This was not the whole of life, but it became a powerful layer placed over life. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it shows a society learning to turn memory into administration. And administration is never only about remembering. It is about deciding which memories matter enough to become durable, which duties are worth tracking, which goods require control, and which people must appear in the record. In that quiet decision, writing began to do more than save the past. It began to shape the future. A clay mark could follow a person past the doorway, past the spoken explanation, into a memory held by others who may never have seen the original act with their own eyes clearly for themselves. To know how to make a sign was to stand near a new kind of memory. In a world where most people still depended on voice, gesture, habit, and witness, the trained writer could place an event onto clay and let it remain. That skill was not only technical, it changed a person's position inside society. The one who could read a record could see duties that others might only remember. The one who could write could help decide how grain, labor, animals, fields, and offerings were named, measured, and preserved. This did not mean every scribe was powerful in the same way, or that writing immediately created a separate ruling class everywhere. The reality was more gradual and more human, but literacy placed certain people closer to the centers where goods, decisions, and obligations passed through formal memory. A spoken agreement needs living witnesses. A written agreement can be carried into another room, kept in a storehouse, compared later, or used by people who were not present when the act first happened. At the beginning of human life, authority often depended on presence, age, skill, trust, and remembered experience. A person who knew the safest path, the best tool method, the old boundary, or the right season could guide others because knowledge lived in them. With writing, some knowledge began to live outside the knower. It could be stored under control. It could be taught to selected hands. It could be guarded, copied, counted, and checked. This made memory less equal in practice, because not everyone could approach the written surface with the same confidence. A worker might know the weight of the basket they carried, but the record might define that weight in the language of an institution. A herder might know every animal by sight, but the account might preserve only the number and responsibility. A farmer might know the field through mud, water, and fatigue. But the tablet could turn the field into yield, measure, or obligation. The person able to read that tablet stood between lived knowledge and official memory. That position mattered. It could protect accuracy, but it could also make everyday life depend on signs that many people could not fully inspect. At the origin of our species, memory passed through shared attention inside a group. The power of memory came from being known together. Writing slowly separated memory from the full group and placed some of it into trained systems. This gave institutions a longer reach. A temple household, palace office, or administrative store could remember beyond the voices of the workers who filled it. It could continue a claim after a person died. It could compare one season with another. It could make obligations travel through time. For those who controlled or understood records, the past became more available as evidence. For those outside the written system, the past might still live in memory, but memory could become weaker than clay when disagreement arose. This is one reason the oldest writing feels calm on the surface and heavy underneath. It does not only show what people counted, it shows that counting itself had become socially important enough to require trained eyes. The world before us was therefore not simply a world learning to write. It was a world learning that written memory could stand above spoken memory in certain places. No one can finish translating that world completely because power was not always written as power. It appears indirectly in who counted, who was counted, who named, who was named, who held the tablet, and who lived inside the record without being able to speak through it. Once writing entered the places where food, labour, land, and authority were managed, history itself began to change shape. The past had always existed before writing. People had always lived, remembered, taught, suffered, worked, cared, feared, and died. But written records changed which pieces of the past could travel farthest. A spoken memory depends on a chain of living people. If the chain breaks, the memory may fade, or become story, or sink into silence. A written record can break away from the person who made it and still remain. Because of that, later generations often inherit the past through the things that were written down, not through the full range of things that actually happened. This is one of the deepest powers of early writing. It did not merely preserve history. It helped choose the doorway through which history would be seen. A storehouse account survives more easily than a whispered complaint. A royal claim survives more easily than a worker's private doubt. A list of offerings survives more easily than the quiet hunger of someone outside the list. This does not mean the written record is false. It means the written record is selective. It gives us durable truth from certain positions, while leaving other truths almost without a surface. At the origin of human life, memory belonged to the group in a wider and more fragile way. The old path, the old danger, the old boundary, the old story, the skill of making, the warning at night, the meaning of a face. These were carried through shared attention. No single clay tablet stood above them. But as societies grew larger and more layered, writing gave special strength to memories connected with institutions. What a temple, palace, household, or office needed to remember had a better chance of crossing time. What a tired body felt while serving that system often had no such chance. The oldest writing therefore teaches us to read with both trust and caution. Trust, because the marks are real traces of real organization. Caution, because they are not the whole past speaking evenly. When a tablet records grain, it may also hide the field. When it records labor, it may also hide the person. When it records a title, it may also hide the everyday negotiations that made the title powerful. History after writing becomes more visible, but not more complete. It becomes visible through surviving forms. It passes through the hands of those who could write, those who ordered writing, those whose work needed to be counted, and those whose voices rarely entered the clay. At the origin of our species, no human life was less real because it left no record. The same remains true for early cities. The people outside writing were not outside history. They were outside the easiest path of preservation. This is why the title's question cannot be answered with a single dramatic secret. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it preserves selected pieces from a society already moving through time before modern eyes arrived. And no one can finish translating it in the deepest sense because history is not only marks, it is also the silence around marks, the life that made them useful, and the many human experiences that were never allowed, never needed, or never able to become durable signs. The first records gave humanity a memory outside the body, but that memory looked in certain directions more than others. From that moment on, the past was not only what had happened. It was also what could be counted, sealed, stored, named, and kept long enough for strangers to mistake survival for completeness. Writing opened a doorway into the ancient world, but it was a narrow doorway. It let certain things pass through time with surprising strength. Names, numbers, deliveries, fields, animals, measures, titles, offerings, and duties. Yet many things that make a human life feel whole did not cross that doorway easily. The earliest records rarely tell us how a person slept after a day of work, how fear moved through a household during a bad season, how a child learned the sound of an elder's voice, or how families arranged themselves around food, grief, birth, illness, and silence. They rarely preserve the tone of a command, the softness of a private conversation, or the tired breath of someone carrying grain into storage. The clay could hold a sign, but it could not hold the whole atmosphere of a life. This is not a failure of ancient people. It is the nature of writing when it first served the urgent needs of organized society. It remembered what could be listed and checked more easily than what could only be felt, heard, or lived. At the origin of human life, meaning was not divided from the body. A warning came with a face and a direction of movement. A story came with rhythm, breath, and the listener's nearness. Sleep was guarded by the group, not recorded as a private event. Fear had weight in the chest and in the choices people made before dark. Family life was made of repeated tasks, shared food, remembered places, touch, attention, and ordinary dependence. Much of that world left almost no durable trace. A record might say that food was issued, but not who slept hungry the night before. It might name a worker, but not the home that worker returned to. It might preserve a ration, but not the conversation around the meal. It might show that animals were counted, but not the low sounds they made in the yard, or the patience of the person watching them. The oldest writing therefore gives us history with many quiet absences inside it. These absences matter because they remind us that the written past is not the whole past. A society can be visible in accounts, while its intimate life remains dim. We may know that institutions managed grain, but not how ordinary people explained hardship to their children. We may know that work was organized, but not how bodies rested, healed, aged, or endured. We may know that names existed, but not how those names sounded when spoken with affection or anger. At the origin of our species, human memory had been broad because it lived inside relationships. People remembered not only facts, but the feeling of being with others, the timing of daily work, the smell of a place, the dangers of night, and the calm that came when a known voice was near. Writing preserved a thinner layer. It was strong enough to outlast walls and generations, yet too narrow to save every form of human presence. This is why the oldest writing can feel both close and distant. Close, because the signs were made by hands like ours. Distant, because the life around those signs has mostly withdrawn. No translation can fully restore a lost evening, a family arrangement, a sleepless fear, or the sound of a person speaking in a room whose walls have vanished. The records are precious because they remain, but they also teach restraint. They ask us to read what is there and to respect what is not there. The first writing did not capture humanity entire. It captured selected traces from a living world, while much of ordinary human experience continued to pass through breath, sleep, touch, memory, and silence. Not every human past entered writing, and not every society needed writing in order to have history. This is one of the most important cautions when looking at the oldest records. Clay tablets, seals, and written signs survive in certain places because certain materials, institutions, and habits made survival possible. But beyond those records were many communities whose memories lived mainly in speech, ritual, work, movement, landscape, and repeated teaching. Their histories were real, even when they did not become durable marks. A group could remember an old migration without writing it down. A family could preserve knowledge of plants, water, animals, boundaries, tools, and ancestors without pressing signs into clay. A community could carry law, warning, identity, and meaning through spoken forms that trained the ear and memory. If those voices faded without a lasting surface, the history did not become less human. It only became harder for later strangers to reach. At the beginning of human life, this was the normal condition. For a vast stretch of time, human beings lived through memory held in bodies and shared presence. The past was carried by those who had seen, heard, made, suffered, learned, and returned. A path remembered by feet could be as important as a written boundary. A story repeated by elders could hold more guidance than a list of goods. A craft taught by touch and imitation could preserve knowledge across generations without leaving a sentence behind. Writing changed preservation, but it did not create human depth. It simply made some forms of depth easier for archaeology to see. This matters because written societies can appear louder in history than unwritten ones. They leave names where others leave tools. They leave accounts where others leave hearths, bones, seeds, footprints, pigments, houses, burials, or changes in the land. They leave voices that seem to speak, while other people remain visible only through material traces. But material silence is not emptiness. A stone tool can show skill. A hearth can show repeated presence. A burial can suggest care, though we must be careful not to claim more than the evidence allows. A pattern of settlement can show adaptation, movement, and shared life. These traces do not speak like tablets, yet they still belong to history. They ask different questions and give different answers. At the origin of our species, no written record announced what humans were becoming. The evidence came from bodies, tools, marks, food remains, shelters, landscapes, and the slow changes left by human action. In that older way of knowing, history is not a page. It is a field of traces, many of them fragile, many of them partial. Written records are powerful because they can name and count, but they can also make us forget how much of human life was never meant for text. The communities without writing were not living outside time. They were living inside time with different methods of memory. Their past could be held in voices, ceremonies, roots, and obligations known to those who belonged. When those living carriers disappeared, much became difficult to recover. That loss is not proof that nothing happened. It is proof that history depends on the kinds of evidence time allows to remain. The oldest writing describes one doorway into the human past, but around that doorway stretches a much larger darkness filled with people who remembered, taught, worked, loved, feared, and died without leaving words for us to translate. The first written records open the past and limit it at the same time. They let us see names, goods, measures, labour, places, and obligations that would otherwise have disappeared completely. Without them, much of early urban life in southern Mesopotamia would be harder to describe with confidence. Yet those same records also remind us that most of human experience never entered clay. They make the ancient world visible through narrow lines, and those lines can tempt us to believe that what survived is equal to what happened. It is not. A tablet is not a society. A list is not a day. A name is not a person. A number is not hunger, effort, trust, or fear. The earliest writing gives us a doorway, but the doorway is smaller than the house behind it. When we step through it, we enter only the rooms that record-keeping chose to preserve. At the beginning of human life, the past had no written doorway at all. It lived in bodies, in learning, in repeated paths, in watched hands, in sounds remembered by those who heard them, and in customs carried because people kept practicing them. For a very long time, that was enough for human communities to survive. Writing changed the durability of memory, not the reality of experience. It made certain facts stronger against time, while leaving other facts almost defenseless. The first records, therefore, produce a double lesson. They are invaluable because they rescue traces from silence. They are humbling because they show how much silence remains. We can read that grain was measured, yet not every meal that followed. We can read that workers were counted, yet not every pain in the body or thought in the mind. We can read that animals were listed, yet not every dawn spent watching them, every loss, every repair, every ordinary conversation between people whose names may never appear. The oldest writing points towards social order, but the full texture of that order often lies outside the marks. This is why careful history must listen both to evidence and to absence. Evidence tells us where our feet may stand. Absence tells us where we must not pretend to see. If a record is administrative, it should not be forced to become a private diary. If a word is uncertain, it should not be made dramatic for the sake of a stronger story. If a silence remains, it may simply be silence, not a hidden revelation. At the origin of our species, every human life was already more complete than any trace it could leave behind. The same is true for the people who lived near the first tablets. Their worlds were full of weather, fatigue, sleep, skill, family, aging, illness, hunger, laughter, memory, and fear, even when only grain and numbers survived. Writing helped humanity carry memory beyond the body, but it did not carry the entire body with it. It kept selected signs while time removed the voice, the gesture, the room, and the shared understanding that once completed them. It lived in breath before it lived in clay, and many of its deepest meanings remained tied to bodies that could not cross millennia with patience as fired earth. The first written record is therefore both a beginning and a warning. It begins the long archive of readable history, but it warns us that readable history is never all of history. There were always people just beyond the edge of the tablet. People who made the food, moved the animals, raised children, repaired tools, told stories, remembered old ways, and slept under skies that left no words behind. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it lets a small portion of that world remain visible. But it also teaches that most of the human past did not vanish because it was unimportant. It vanished because it was alive. The oldest writing teaches us that human beings eventually needed a memory that could live outside the body. For most of our existence, memory had depended on flesh. The brain that recognized a face, the hand that remembered a tool, the ear that held a warning, the voice that carried a name from one generation to another. This living memory was powerful, but it had human limits. It grew tired. It could be confused. It could die with the person who carried it. In small groups, knowledge could remain close to the people who used it, because everyone moved within a circle of shared attention. A path was remembered because feet returned to it. A skill was remembered because hands repeated it. A story survived because someone cared enough to tell it again. But when communities became larger, more settled, and more dependent on storage, counting, exchange, and institutions, memory needed a second home. The clay tablet became one form of that home. It allowed a quantity, a name, a duty, or an act to remain after the speaker had gone silent. This was not simply a technical change. It was a change in what a human being could leave behind. At the beginning of human life, the body was the main archive of the world. It stored movement, danger, kinship, hunger, place, and craft through attention and repetition. Writing did not replace that ancient archive. It extended one narrow stream of it into matter. It made some thoughts less dependent on breath. A remembered debt could become a mark. A counted flock could become a sign. A person's name could enter clay and wait for someone who had never heard that person speak. This waiting is one of the deepest gifts of writing. It lets the past remain available after the living chain has broken. Yet the gift came with a cost. When memory leaves the body, it must become smaller. It must choose a shape. It cannot carry everything at once. The tablet can hold a number more easily than a fear. It can hold a title more easily than a lifetime. It can hold a name more easily than the warmth, anger, or tenderness with which that name was spoken. So the first writing does not show the whole human being. It shows what could be fixed, checked, and recognized by a system. That is why it describes a world before us in a calm and incomplete way. It reveals a society that had already grown beyond ordinary memory, but it also shows that human life was too wide for any early record to contain. At the origin of our species, survival depended on memory inside the living group. Later, in the first written worlds, survival also depended on memory stored outside the group, in clay, seals, signs, and trained habits of reading. This outside memory changed time itself. A spoken word belongs to its moment. A written mark can remain in the dark after the room collapses. It can be found by strangers who do not know the language fully, who do not share the customs, who stand thousands of years away and still feel the pressure of an ancient hand. The oldest writing, therefore, teaches a humble lesson about being human. We are creatures who remember, but also creatures who know that remembering is fragile. We made signs because the mind could not hold everything, because society became too layered for voice alone, and because time was always taking more than the body could protect. Writing began as a way to keep certain things from vanishing, but its survival also reminds us how much of every human world remains outside the memory it saves. Writing gives the past a surface, but it does not make the past whole. This is the quiet lesson that begins to appear when we look long enough at the oldest records. A clay tablet can bring us close to an ancient hand, close enough to see pressure, direction, habit, and intention. It can show that someone counted grain, named a person, marked a place, recorded labour, or fixed responsibility in a form that could remain. Yet the same tablet also keeps a distance. It does not give us the whole room, the whole day, or the whole life. It lets us touch the edge of what was lost, not possess it completely. That difference matters. If writing made the past perfectly clear, ancient history would feel like a room with all its lamps still burning. Instead, it feels more like a dim doorway. We can see shapes inside, and some of them are real enough to study carefully, but the air, the voices, the small meanings, and the ordinary assumptions have mostly gone. At the beginning of human life, memory was carried by living bodies, and because it was living, it included more than information. It included tone, nearness, fear, trust, repetition, weather, hunger, skill, and the quiet knowledge that comes from doing the same task with others over time. Writing saved selected traces from that living field, but it could not save the field itself. A sign may preserve a name, yet not the face that made the name familiar. A line may preserve a measure, yet not the weight of the basket or the silence of the person carrying it. A record may preserve an offering, yet not the thoughts of those who watched it happen. This does not make writing weak. It makes writing honest when we approach it carefully. It was never a complete replacement for life. It was a narrow bridge built across loss. Across that bridge, some things travelled with surprising strength. Numbers, names, duties, repeated formulas, official habits, traces of institutions. Other things fell away. Private speech, family memory, the inner texture of work, the emotional weight of a season, the feeling of sleeping under a sky whose constellations were known by names we may never hear. At the origin of our species, human beings learned the world through presence. The body knew before the tablet knew. The eye followed a hand, the ear recognized a warning, the foot remembered a path, and the group carried meaning through shared life. Writing changed what could endure. After presence vanished, it allowed strangers in a far future to meet pieces of an ancient world without belonging to it. That is why translation can be both powerful and unfinished. It can bring a sign into modern language, but it cannot always return the living conditions that once completed the sign. It can say what a record most likely did, but not every unspoken rule that made the record normal. It can open a path into the past, but the path does not lead everywhere. The oldest writing describes a world before us because it keeps the hard remains of a society that was already deep, organized, and meaningful before our questions arrived. It does not prove that every lost meaning can be recovered. It teaches the opposite, gently and firmly. To read ancient writing well is to accept that knowledge and humility must stay together. The clay allows us to touch the past, but what we touch is a surviving surface, and beneath that surface lies a human world that once lived fully, then receded beyond the reach of complete translation. The oldest writing leaves us with a calm and difficult truth. Human beings learned to save memory, but never learned to save everything. Clay could hold a sign longer than a voice could live in air. It could keep a name after the mouth was gone, keep a number after the basket was emptied, keep a duty after the witness had died. Yet every act of saving was also an act of narrowing. What became durable was not always what was most human. A tablet could remember grain, but not the dream of the person who harvested it. It could remember a title, but not the private doubt behind the title. It could remember that something was given, owed, received, or counted, but not always why that moment mattered to the people standing there. This is the final humility inside the first writing. It does not let us own the past. It lets us approach it carefully. At the beginning of human life, memory lived in bodies and in groups. A child learned through watching. A path survived because feet returned to it. A warning lived because a voice carried it before danger arrived. A dead person remained present because others spoke their name. Writing did not erase that older world. It rose from it, after human societies had become too wide for memory alone. The first signs were not the beginning of human meaning. They were the moment when some meaning began to leave breath and settle into matter. That moment changed history, but it also created a new kind of silence. Once memory was placed on clay, future people could read what survived and forget how much had not been written. That is why the oldest writing on earth describes a world before us in such a strange way. It describes that world through traces, not wholeness, through accounts, not full lives, through signs that once felt ordinary to their makers and now feel distant because the surrounding world has disappeared. The unfinished translation is not only a scholarly problem, it is a human condition. No translation can restore every lost voice, every known gesture, every shared rule, every small room where the signs once made complete sense. At the origin of our species, knowing was not separate from being together. Meaning moved through nearness, tone, habit, and trust. Ancient writing broke one thread of that living fabric free and allowed it to cross thousands of years, but the rest of the fabric remained with the people who lived inside it. This is why reading the oldest writing should not make us hungry for dramatic certainty. It should make us patient. It should teach that the past is real even when it is incomplete, and that honesty is not weaker than mystery. A careful mind can honor what the evidence shows without filling every silence with invention. A calm listener can understand that lost context is not a failure of imagination, but a reminder of time's power. The educational value of these earliest records is not that they reveal a perfect secret about a forgotten world. It is that they show the oldest human struggle to keep life from vanishing completely. We still live with that struggle. We write names, save messages, count days, keep records, preserve photographs, and hope that something of us will remain understandable to people we will never meet. Yet even now, the deepest parts of a life often remain outside the record. The tone of a voice, the warmth of a hand, the fear before sleep, the memory no one else heard. If the first writing could not carry an entire world across time, what part of our own world is already becoming impossible for the future to translate?